Good evening, everybody. This is Brendon Baillod. I'm the host of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group, and also kind of your guide tonight when we talk about a new and interesting subject that I decided to do a presentation on. We're going to give it a few minutes for people to start joining here on the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group. So we start officially here at 7 o'clock. Tonight's presentation is on Great Lakes vessel accident lists and our new database that we'll be releasing. So we will be discussing pretty much every aspect of archival data that's available out there in terms of Great Lakes vessel accidents. We'll also be talking about the effort to get that data from these kind of rare archival documents and get that into an online searchable format. So we'll give it another minute for people to join. For those of you who are just joining, I'd like to encourage you to post comments in the chat. I can see them. Particularly that's important if I go offline or if I have some problem with the transmission. So feel free. In fact, if you're on right now, please throw a couple of comments in the chat so I can see that you're there. All right. So a couple of things, just some housekeeping. It's been a while since we've had a program here on the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group. We used to do our semi-weekly program, Great Lakes Shipwrecks Live. I may be bringing that back here, trying to get a little bit more content going. It's a fair amount of work, obviously, to get this stuff going. So bear with me. It does take some time. All right. Why don't we launch into things? Again, if you can't, okay, good. We've got some people on there chatting. All right. Without further ado, let's launch into it. So, for those of you who just joined, I'm Brendon Baillod, the administrator here at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group, and the creator of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research website. One of the things that I just recently did was register the domain shipwreck.info, which unbelievably was still available. I used to have ship-wreck.com and ship-wreck.org. I've also remapped those onto a new site. So you may ask, why did I do that? Well, most of you are aware that all of the major shipwreck and Great Lakes vessel research databases on the internet have gone down and have been offline for the last few months. For those of you who don't know, that is because of a ransomware attack on the city of Hamilton, Ontario. They hosted a large software infrastructure called Our Digital World, and that was used by a lot of historical societies and different groups to host their historical content. And when the city of Hamilton, their servers were encrypted, all those sites went offline. If you read the news, you know that the city of Hamilton decided not to pay the cryptocurrency to the hackers, and so all those sites are now offline indefinitely. Walter Lewis is working to get them back, but that kind of is the main reason why I decided to put my databases back online. Not so much out of the goodness of my heart, as much as I needed to do research as well. So having my old databases online was a logical thing to do. You may notice I put the Dave Swayze shipwreck database back online with the help directly from Dave, and also the Chuck Feltner enrollment database with permission of Jerry Feltner. And so I host those now. Many of you may know that I was a software engineer before I went into management. And so I do the programming myself and the database development myself. So without further ado, let's talk about my new database that I am working on and what it's going to encompass. First, I'll talk a little bit about the shipwreck accident lists, and then we'll talk about the database. So here we go. All right. So Great Lakes vessel accident lists and my database. The idea for this came to me many years ago as a result of research that I had been doing since I was a young man. When I was in my early 20s, I got to meet a lot of the sort of foundational figures in Great Lakes maritime history research that were still alive at the time. Many of them still are, but aren't active anymore. These were people like Pat Labadie, Jerry Metzler, Jack Messmer, Dick Palmer, who's still alive. Actually, a lot of these guys still are. Walter Lewis, and Bill McNeil, late Bill McNeil. All of these guys, we shared old news clips. Dave Swayze was among them too, about wrecks. But mostly we shared these accident lists that we had found, and there were many of them that dated back as early as the 1840s. So what we noticed is that in about 1840, the newspapers started to publish these lists of every single mishap that happened on the Great Lakes in that season. And the reason that they did it is really for the insurance industry. They were insuring Great Lakes vessels, and the rate of accident on the Great Lakes was much, much higher than on the ocean. And so ocean rates didn't work on the Great Lakes. If you wanted to know how much to charge for a policy, you needed to know what the chances were of a vessel getting in an accident. So they started to, figure it out by, literally recording every single accident. It was really important to be accurate about it. And so they paid people, whose only job it was to collect the accidents that they could find from all the regional newspapers around the lakes. And so in Buffalo and Oswego, New York, this primarily happened. The Northwestern Insurance Company in Oswego was the first to really get serious about it. Captain Daniel Dobbins was one of the first people who started to compile the lists, and it became a tradition across the lakes throughout the 1800s because they started to publish these lists as a means of showing just how dangerous the Great Lakes were, but also because with popular reading, people followed the vessels very closely, and these annual lists became a thing. They were published throughout the 1800s, as I mentioned, and they're an excellent resource for information on shipwrecks. But the real reason we use them is because they tell us a lot about vessel careers. If you go look through them, you'll find that even the most obscure two-masted schooners appear in the lists multiple times because every vessel got into trouble pretty frequently, usually at least once a season. And so it tells us a lot about what routes those vessels were on, what trades they were in, what cargoes, the values of their cargoes oftentimes are given. So it really is a good tool for telling the story of a ship. Say you find a shipwreck and you want to nominate to the National Register. The first thing I did when I found the Trinidad was I typed Trinidad into the database and brought up about 15 different accidents it was in over the course of its life. So very useful if you can do that. But the problem is that all those lists, not even, most of them haven't even been transcribed. So what I did is I started to transcribe them into spreadsheets, and I got up to about 20,000 accidents with the help of some of volunteers. And then I put it on the shelf, and then my ISP, quit hosting the language that I had coded my old database in. So I just let it go offline about 15 years ago. Well, since I put it back online, I've restarted the transcription effort. So what I'm going to do is talk about some of the lists that are the most important, and then I'm going to give you a demo of the beta version of the database. And from there, then, and don't forget at 8 o'clock after this is over, we're going to have a live Zoom conversation as well, mostly just to, shoot the shit and drink beer. But please do join because we'll also be talking about this. You can ask me questions directly. All right, moving along. Early lists. So it's interesting to note that even before the actuarial lists, there are some very early lists of Great Lakes vessel accidents that were compiled and are quite interesting. A fellow named C.S. Daniels did a list of the wrecks in the Muskegon, Michigan area from 1832 to 55. And a lot of those wrecks from the 1830s don't appear anywhere else. They're not even mentioned in the papers. So an interesting list. We have a similar list down here that you can see from the Buffalo City Directory that has all the wrecks on Lake Michigan beginning in 1823. He's missing a couple notables at Chicago from 1817 and 1818, but some of these are quite interesting. And a lot of these vessels are vessels that are known to have been in the lake. Some I can't find, like the schooner Red Jacket or the schooner Lawrence from the 1820s. But again, a very interesting list. Probably the most important list that was published was that of the Milwaukee Sentinel on February 1st, 1843, by Wisconsin's own citizen scientist, Increase Lapham. He was very interested in the rate of shipwreck on the Great Lakes because he was advocating for the foundation of a weather bureau, a federal weather bureau, because of all the losses due to storm. He believed that the weather was scientifically predictable and that by observing the rate of shipwreck on the lakes, they could tell when these storms happened and reduce the losses, the loss of life. And so he made this list in 1843, February 1st, of all the wrecks that had happened on Lake Michigan up to that point. And it was a very useful list. It was sent to the United States government, and they sat on it for 20 years and didn't do anything. There were other lists published in 1844 and 1845, but one of the most interesting is the 1850 steamboat disasters. The proceedings of a meeting and report of a committee of the citizens of Cleveland in relation to steamboat disasters on the Western Lakes. This particular document is really cool because it goes through all the different steamboat explosions, collisions, people that fell overboard, you name it, up to 1850 on the Great Lakes. And so a pretty lightly circulated document. Again, these are all things that I collected over the years by trading documents with other researchers. And so I have these all in the collection. Part of the reason I keep the paper is because well, if the database goes down, I still have these, right? All right, let's talk about some other lists. A couple of other things I did. I created my own early Lake Michigan accident list, 1800 to 1850, and I compiled this myself from a lot of different sources. I have it in a Word document. I don't have it in the database, but it is an interesting list because it includes a lot of, I would say, spurious accounts from the early 1800s. So anytime I found a mention or an attribution of a shipwreck, say before 1830 on Lake Michigan, and there weren't many, I would record it in there, even if, it maybe needs more research. So it's an interesting list. If anybody's interested in it, let me know. I did this, 15, 20 years ago, but it's pretty good. I used all the sources I had at my disposal, and I had many even then. I also did annual accident lists for the database specifically because nobody had published a list for 1841, 43, or 46. So I went through the papers myself and through all the sources I had and created accident lists for those years, not just of total losses, but every accident mentioned in the papers for those years. To do that, you had to go to the Buffalo papers, the Oswego papers, the Cleveland papers, Kingston, Ontario, and also certainly the Detroit papers, the Milwaukee papers, and the Chicago papers. If you hit all those papers, you tend to get everything. Oftentimes, it's really only necessary to go to the Buffalo papers because they usually reprinted everything from all of the aforementioned papers, but not always. All right. The next most important set of early rec lists that exists are the Eric Heil rec lists. Many of you know of Eric Heil through his epic work, Early American Steamers. I show the 6-volume set here. I collected them many years ago. Now they're quite hard to find. Eric Heil lived from, I believe, he died in 1970. He was born, I think, about 1890. And he was in Buffalo. He was a stamp collector and became very interested in the postage stamps that were postmarks of letters mailed from steamships. And by that way, he got into researching them. And his 6-volume set has these beautiful pen and ink drawings of all the vessels, as well as an exploration of their careers. But a lot of people don't know that he made annual rec lists from 1847 to 1856, and then he did another one for 1864. These are currently untranscribed. I currently have a volunteer who is working to transcribe these. These are going into the database. They should be done within the next month or two. Heil did these out of the Buffalo papers, and he took every single accident that the Buffalo papers mentioned from any place on the Great Lakes. So these are going into the database for sure. Next, we have two really important comprehensive compiled lists that I collected over many years. They're very important lists. They are not going into the database yet because they're just massive. The biggest one and probably the most famous is the Herman Runge Wreck List. Runge was a maritime historian based in Milwaukee. He was active from his birth. He was born in 1875 and died in 1958. His collection served as the basis for the collection at the Milwaukee Public Library and was the reason for the founding of the Wisconsin Marine Historical Society. Probably his most famous artifact is his wreck list, which runs from 1679 until his death in 1958. This was done not only from papers, but also from the annual lists of U.S. merchant vessels, from every Great Lakes Marine Directory, from every source he could find. And it's pretty good after about 1875. Before that, it's a little sketchy. The other one is John Poole's wreck list. John Poole was a similar maritime historian to Runge. He was a little later. Poole, I think he died in 1954. He moved around the Great Lakes quite a bit for his work, but the majority of his collection is at the Historical Collections of the Great Lakes at Bowling Green State University. His wreck list covers 1892 to 1940, which is really good because there's not a lot of good sources for wrecks, after 1900. And these are also just accidents, not total losses, whereas Runge's is total losses. Poole's, I believe, mentions every accident. So these have never been transcribed or compiled. They would be an excellent resource to do so with. But probably the most famous wreck lists and the most interesting and most important are these on this page. And these are the real reason I created my database. The big one is the Board of Lake Underwriters accident lists from 1855 to 1863. This is the picture here is my own original copy of the 1863. I've only ever seen this one original copy. I think they have the others. I have copies of from Bowling Green, which I think they had them. They were collected by Richard Wright, the maritime historian. But in any event, the Board of Lake Underwriters was an insurance consortium that insured the hulls on the Great Lakes. They're a consortium of every insurance company on the lakes, and they really cared about this actuarial stuff to set rates. And so they recorded literally every single accident, the loss to the cargo, and the loss to the hull. And as you can see, for 1863, there are literally, several hundred accidents that year. Some years there were over 1,000 accidents. So you get the idea how many there are. I have all of these from 1855 to 63. I transcribed them all with help from others. I don't think I did them all, but I didn't number them myself. And these are all in my online database. Likewise, after the Board of Lake Underwriters stopped, Captain John W. Hall, who was a Marine reporter at Detroit, started compiling the same data. And he was doing it for the insurance companies. He did it from 1865 to 1873. His wreck lists were published in bound hardcover books, which are quite rare. The John W. Hall wreck lists are really invaluable. I have them all. They're all transcribed and in the database. The next one is one I found myself cold. The Aetna Insurance Company Great Lakes Vessel Accident Claims Ledger. It's a printed document that is actually available on Google Books. It lists every claim they paid out on the Great Lakes from 1853 to 1867 and lists vessel names and who the people were that got the payments. And so it's a good source. It doesn't list the dates or the exact nature of the accident. It's more focused on the claims paid. I have this in the database. I've transcribed it. Probably the largest and most important, though, of these lists that's in my database now and completely transcribed are the accident lists of the chief signal officer of the Weather Bureau. So Increase Lapham was eventually successful in getting the United States government to create a weather bureau. It was originally under the United States Army under the chief signal officer. In 1868, he made another very large list that he sent to Congress. This after his original one in 1843 was sort of poo-pooed. And they took it up and started the Weather Bureau. And then they assigned somebody, after Lapham moved on, they assigned somebody to compile these lists every year. And they published them in the annual reports of the chief signal officer. And I've got a few of them in original. Most of them are digitized online, but they had to be transcribed because the text wasn't good enough for optical character recognition. So we finished transcribing these about 10 years ago. They have hundreds and hundreds of accidents in every year, very similar to these Board of Lake Underwriters lists. These are all in the database. And lastly, we were missing comprehensive accident lists for 1864 and 68. As luck would have it, the Detroit papers published an 1864 list, and the Milwaukee paper published an 1868 list independently that were made for the insurance companies. And so I have those. Those are also transcribed and in the database. And thank you, Mark Gamage, because Mark just finished the 1864 list. We didn't have any 1864 list until really last week. So these are probably the most important. If you think about the lists that are in the database, they're the most comprehensive, that constitute most of the 20,000 accidents. They're these. All right. Let's talk about some other really more important lists that are not finished. The Customs Bureau, a lot of people don't know this, made required rec reports. These are the people that, where you had to enroll vessels, right? Great Lakes vessel enrollments. Well, they also, when a vessel had an accident where there was a claim, it had to be reported to the Customs House. And around 1961, the National Archives found this large, old, musty ledger, and it had a bunch of vessel accident reports from the Great Lakes. And so they microfilmed it, and then they screwed up and put it in records group 26 with the Coast Guard records and the Life Saving Service records, because they thought it might have something to do with that. But it goes from 1863 to 1873, and it predates the Life Saving Service by several years. So it can't be a Life Saving Service document. I finally figured out what it was when I started researching the customs houses. This is the master abstract book for every record report that was submitted on the Great Lakes from every vessel between 1863 and 1873. And it's really, really long. I mean, I think there's about 6,000 accidents in it. And it gives the name of the vessel, the tonnage, where it was, the nature of the accident, the loss to the hull, the loss of lives, and the loss of cargo. It's really an excellent document. Only parts of it have been transcribed. It's not yet in my database. I am looking for a volunteer who is willing to take this on. The penmanship is abysmal, but it is generally legible, and I've been able to, identify every vessel in it. Also, and this is something that I'm working on with Walt Lewis that isn't necessarily going to end up in my database, but there are full Customs House rec reports that were made and that have been preserved at the National Archives starting in 1874 and going up to about 1936. Here you see one of them on the right. This is what they look like. They look a lot like a life-saving service rec report, but they're quite different in terms of who makes them out. These are actually made out by the vessel captain, and they list all the details about every little accident. They're not all about total losses. So Walter went with Jim Jarecki, and they filmed, I think, about 8,000 of these down there. And now we have a separate project once Walter's site's back up to transcribe the data off of these that's relevant for a search engine. And these will be put on Walter's site behind a search engine. You'll be able to search all these accident reports. Now, they're not comprehensive. That's why these other accident lists are so important, is because these record reports weren't preserved for all years for all ports, right? Only for some. So the Customs House stuff is really important, really important resource for Great Lakes accident information. And we do want to get this ledger of early accidents transcribed. All right, let's talk about the Life Saving Service accident reports we have. So one of the things, these are not transcribed either, and it would be a cool thing to do. I have all the annual reports of the U.S. Life Saving Service in my collection in original from 1877 to 1915. They really didn't start to have the Great Lakes Customs Houses stations didn't come online until about 1878. So you don't see a lot of Great Lakes stuff in the early years, but this is a page, and they list every single call the Life Saving Service went on, and they give the vessel name and the locality for every district on the Great Lakes. These would be really interesting to transcribe because they're useful. Keep in mind, though, they're only those accidents where the Life Saving Service was involved. Now, they also have station logs that are at the National Archives for every call that every station went on. Here you see from the Kenosha station, this is their report of their rescue of the crew of the schooner Edna, which sank and is still on the bottom out there off Kenosha and has never been found yet, even though it's in like 70 feet of water. But you can see it's very detailed. It's a really interesting document. These have also not been compiled in any meaningful way. And lastly, they have a few weird lists at the National Archives that are abstracted accident lists for different districts on the Great Lakes of calls. They don't come from the annual reports. I think they come from, they may be abstracts of the calls. But I have 3 lists like this that are available from the National Archives. They're pretty long. They tend to be from the period 1895 to 1915. And they've never been transcribed either. I'd like to get those done and put into the database. All right. Now here's the granddaddy of them all. A lot of people don't know that the annual lists of U.S. merchant vessels contain an annual loss list beginning in 1906 and running up to 1994. I happen to have every single one of the annual list of U.S. merchant vessels in original in my collection. And so I have all these. Here's an example of the 1920 loss list. You can see the loss of the Frank O'Connor off of Canna Island on Lake Michigan in here, and many others. And it lists, the name of the vessel, its official number, where it was lost. In some instances, it gives coordinates. Now, what to keep in mind here is that 80% of these are ocean losses, right? 20% of them are Great Lakes losses. So going through here, they're good enough for optical character recognition, probably. Although this, you can see how it's columnated, so you really probably would be better off typing it. But I'd love to extract the Great Lakes vessel accidents out of every one of these years in the 1900s because no one's done it. There is no source. If you wanted to find these losses, you have to own the full run, which is why over many years I bought them all one at a time. But this would be a good project for somebody, probably somebody who has them, probably me, if I ever retire, to go through and abstract all the Great Lakes accidents from every year. There's maybe 20 per year, so it might take me, a week or two to do a decade. So you get what I mean? It's not an insurmountable task, but boy, would that be nice to have in the database. All right. The other thing I want to mention is Beeson's Marine Directory. So these are really important resources, mostly because they have cool old advertisements and stuff. But I own the only full run of these in a private collection. I own them all from 1890 to 1921. The 3 first years weren't really bound. They were like pamphlets. And the only copies that exist of those are at the University of Michigan's Transportation Library, the originals. But I have really good scans of them from U of M. But I do have originals from 1890 on. Now, in 1895, they started making a list of every accident on the Great Lakes. And 1895 was like literally every fender bender. But they quit doing that pretty quickly because it was bad for business, making their clients look bad. So in 1897, they started only doing total losses, but they listed all the total losses every year up until 1921. And so we have a volunteer who's already working on these. I send pictures of the pages to him, and he's been doing a bang-up job of transcribing them. And these will be added to the database here sometime in the next month. So Beeson's Marine Directory, an excellent source for annual accident losses. The last one I'll talk about, which I think is very interesting and often overlooked, are the Admiralty Court records. So every accident that involved 2 vessels usually had a court case, and a lot of those court cases are still available in these legal abstract books. This is a set that I own from the Michigan Admiralty lawyer Frank Canfield. These were cases he argued before the Michigan the Federal Circuit Court in Michigan, Admiralty cases. And they're pretty interesting because they have first-person testimony of the sailors in them. They're just fascinating to read. I only have a few of these. I have several others that aren't shown here, but they go into quite a bit of detail. But more interesting is the fact that the National Archives frequently gets asked for their court records about these maritime cases from the 1800s. and they had a hard time finding it because there's just thousands of boxes. It's just like in Raiders of the Lost Ark, where things just disappear there into the National Archives. They had thousands of boxes of paper files, so they started to create a finding aid, and they update it pretty regularly. They're still working on it, but the cases start in 1850 and run through about 1930. And this is what I actually have a copy of it. They gave it to me. It's a spreadsheet with a different tab for every district court. This is a sample of Milwaukee's tab just for 1848 and 1849. You can see the different cases, the different vessels, who the plaintiff was. You can search them by schooner. They don't have the date, they just have the year. They have a case number, the type of case, and the people involved. That's about it. They're not really something that would go in my accident list database, but maybe they could. The ones that mention a vessel name specifically. That would be useful because they're already typed in. The other thing that's interesting about them is I did order one of the files. I won't say what ship it was for. This is what it looked like on the right. They're huge. They have tons of information about each one of these court cases. These are the original transcripts from the court, of testimony, of all sorts of stuff. So this one happens to be a vessel collision where we're looking for the ship. It's not been found yet. And reading all these pages of testimony from the National Archives really helped us find more specifically where the vessel probably is. So this master abstract list of all the court cases would be useful if you could pull the ones out that mention vessels, and about 2/3 to 3/4 of them do. All right, let's change channels here. I keep a master list on a spreadsheet of all the accident lists. So I have a database of databases, if you will. And what it does is it shows me every list I know of that's in my collection and what its status is, whether it's been transcribed or whether it's, been put in the database yet or not. And it goes all the way from 1800 up to about 1940. So, really up till 1994 if you count the ones in the annual list of U.S. merchant vessels. So, so that's how I manage it. This is what the beta looks like, and I'm going to take you for a little test run of it. So it's a pretty simple search engine. You can see what I've done is I've coded it so that you can enter the first, last, or both vessel names. I wouldn't enter a full vessel name because they're so variable, right? If you're looking for the Edmund Fitzgerald, it's best to just type Fitz, right? Or if you're looking, well, obviously that's not in here. It's not old enough, but you get what I mean. Also, the vessel types, I've standardized them. Accident place, again, it's useful. That's an interesting thing. Every accident that happened off Manistee, Michigan, for example. But it's important to remember that if you want things off Ludington, for example, that was called Pere Marquette back in the early days. So you get what I mean. You have to be smart to use the search engine. You can't just enter things and expect it to barf out magic data. You have to think about it. Accident year, accident month. I tried to get this total loss field. If it says the word loss or total in it, I list it. Not every total loss says total in it, so it's not foolproof, but it's pretty good. So that's how I constructed it. It's only got 4 fields in the database. It's got year, month, and sometimes date, detail, and source. So it's pretty straightforward. It's just one table, but the search engine's pretty powerful. So before we take it for a test drive, I want to just mention that there's a lot of this work yet to do, right? And so I'm always interested in getting volunteer help. You can email me at baillod@shipwreck.info if you're interested in volunteering. It helps if you're familiar with 19th century Great Lakes vessel names and terms. So a lot of us have seen a lot of these vessel names many times, and so we know how to spell them. We can correct typos. A lot of times the data is handwritten, or it's a Xerox of a Xerox, so it's not real clear. But so it helps to know the data. I always proof each record before I add it to the master file, and I do know the vessels. So I have a encyclopedic memory pretty much now after 40 years of research doing this kind of research. My backend database is in MySQL. That's the name of the database technology. as opposed to something like DB2 or Oracle or SQL Server. It's MySQL is the open source. It's hosted at my internet service provider, so I have to upload a new copy of the database. I keep a master down here in case it goes down. I coded the search engine personally in PHP, which is a open source programming language. I had coded the previous one in Java, but it's more expensive to host Java, so I had to rewrite everything in PHP. So the search engine's still in beta. I'm going to take you for a little test drive of it, and then we will wrap up and switch over to the Zoom meeting. So let's take her for a test drive. Bear with me here while I hide this and show this. All right, so you should all be looking now at the database. So one of the things that you might find is that you want to use. Let's see what we can do here. Let's do Elgin. All right, it returns instantly. So what you can see here is you might think you're just going to find Lady Elgin, but you're also going to find Lord Elgin. And it's also going to find accidents off Port Elgin because it's all in one field. The reason we do that, why it's all in one field, and why we don't ever break it off into separate fields, is that would be a lot of extra work. And a lot of these things were done by optical character recognition. And it is pretty useful still, but you can see a lot of, like here's one from the Aetna insurance company marine loss list, all the payments that they made on the Lady Elgin, for example. Here's the schooner William Elgin. So gives you an idea how that works. So let's try a couple others. Let's try finding all the accidents that happened off of Pentwater. So, it's pretty good. Pentwater before about 1850, really, people didn't reference it. It wasn't well known, so people just said it was near Ludington. But it starts in about 1857, and you get to see we have pretty good detail from the chief signal officer. We have some total losses here. You get the idea. You can really put together a nice list. Now, I truncate these at 100 records. The reason I do that is, I don't want people completely harvesting the whole database. Also, big data sets, take a lot of bandwidth. Let's try all the accidents off Buffalo in 1845. Well, steamer Buffalo. So we don't have a lot of mentions of Buffalo, which is not surprising. Let's try Cleveland. There we go. Quite a few. So you get the idea how the database works. It's actually pretty useful. The other thing I want to do is I want to take a look at how to bring up total losses, and I'll show you how that works. So I want to look at all the total losses to, let's say, to tugs on the Great Lakes. Here we go. So you can see it's pretty good, right? There's some things where it's finding odd words, like here, the brig Mahoning capsized and was lost off of Port Washington, Wisconsin, in tow of the tug Muir. The brig was a total loss, the tug wasn't, but the search engine picks it up that way. So that is, but you can see how it's pretty useful. A lot of these are very obscure. The tug Prairie Flower burned at Saginaw, a total loss from the J.W. Hall wreck lists. So you can see the Weather Bureau, lists are represented. The Chief Signal Officer lists are represented. Some of the newspaper lists. So it is a pretty powerful search tool for finding accidents. The more we can get in here, the more accidents you're going to be able to find. So the Beeson's material is going to be in here pretty soon. The Eric Heil wreck lists are coming in, and one of the things I'd like to do is put in some of these other resources that I've showed you on the screen. We could get this up conceivably to 50,000, 70,000 accidents. because we know there were at least that many on the Great Lakes in those years. And again, what does this do for us? Well, the main thing it does for us isn't so much that we want to find total losses, because we've got things like the Dave Swayze shipwreck database, which are very good for that. What we may want to do is just research the career of a given vessel. So say the Mahoning was a good one, which was a brig. And here you get a quick look at all of the accidents the Mahoning got into in its career. There may be a few others because we're missing a few lists, but this is pretty good. So that's how the database works. It is not perfect, but it's pretty powerful. It's in beta right now. One of the things I'm going to do is kind of dress it up with a prettier screen, and then I'm going to release it to the larger world and put it out there for people to use. So if you're on the thing right now, the URL is, as you saw on the screen, hide this, show this, is shipwreck.info/Baillod. If you want to take it for a test drive, feel free to do so. Please report any bugs you find to me. I'm very eager to correct them. Obviously, if it's just a data anomaly where it found something because the data is the way it is, there's not much I can do about that. But if there's a misspelling in the data or something like that, we can fix that. Some of these I can build an administrative back end for too. So if anybody's interested in, for example, having the ability to correct the data, I could give you access to do that. But in the case of this, it's probably easier just to fix the data and then re-upload the database because it's just one table. So anyway, that's all I have with this. If you have any questions about it or interested in learning more, feel free to reach out. We're going to have this Zoom call here for everybody who wants to participate at 8 o'clock. I may start it a little early. I'll probably start it in 10 minutes or so. I'm going to post the link to the Zoom on the group and in the chat here so that people can join. And feel free to ask any questions. I know I covered a lot of material about different lists and different archival resources that are out there. Somebody says, fix my camera. I have it on. Anyway, we're wrapping up anyway. So thanks everybody for attending. I hope you enjoyed it. I appreciate your interest in the database. Oh, it's blurry. Yeah, a little bit. I appreciate your interest in the database and in helping out with the work. And if you're interested in learning more, do attend the Zoom meeting. So good night, everybody. Boy, join me in the Zoom meeting in 10 minutes.